So we're diving into something pretty big today. A real potential game changer when it comes to how the federal government and its employees interact.
Yeah, this is major.
It's the Federal Workforce Freedom Act.
Senate Bill 1006.
Right, S-1006. And, just looking at it initially, it seems like it's aiming right at the heart of federal collective bargaining.
Exactly. And that's really what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We're going to get beyond the headlines and really dissect how this act works, what it would mean immediately, and then the kind of long-term consequences it could set in motion.
Yeah, because, this isn't just some minor tweak.
Not at all.
This has the potential to totally reshape the landscape.
Absolutely.
So we've been poring over the source material, the actual text of the proposed act itself, and, different analyses and reports breaking it down so we can give everyone a really clear picture of what's on the line here.
That's right.
So let's just jump right into the fundamentals.
Okay.
What are the big goals here? What is this act really trying to do?
Well, it's structured around two main objectives. The first one, you find it in Section 3A. It's all about preventing federal employees from, doing all the things you would normally associate with unions. Basically organizing, joining, being active in labor unions when it comes to negotiating their terms of employment or just having representation.
Okay, so hold on. If this passes, federal employees can't form unions or be part of unions that negotiate their work stuff?
Right.
That's a huge change.
Yeah, and the second objective really goes hand in hand with that. You find that in Section 3B, and it says federal agencies can't recognize unions or negotiate with them in any way.
So no more sitting down at the table.
Nope. And they define federal agency in Section 2A3, pretty much the standard way you'd think of a federal entity. And then labor union, that's in Section 2.4, that's any organization representing federal employees on things like grievances, pay work hours, benefits, the whole 9 yards. So a very deliberate and comprehensive approach to eliminating collective bargaining from how the federal government operates as an employer.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk about the fallout then.
Sure.
Let's say this act goes through, becomes law. What happens right away to the average federal employee?
Well, the most immediate consequence for federal employees would be losing all the rights, benefits, and protections that are in their current collective bargaining agreements.
So all those things that are spelled out in their contracts.
Exactly. We actually have a great source on this. Federal Workforce Bargaining Agreement Termination impacts. It goes through how these agreements cover a really wide range of things. Salaries, of course, how the work week is structured, healthcare, retirement plans, measures to protect their jobs, even the procedures for handling disciplinary actions, all that stuff. It's all in these agreements.
And all of that would just be gone.
Well, legally, it wouldn't be binding anymore. And that would create a lot of uncertainty and anxiety for employees, understandably. Imagine thinking you had certain guarantees about your job and then suddenly they're not enforceable anymore.
No, that's a big deal. And what about the process for resolving disputes, the grievance procedures and arbitration, all that?
Gone too.
Really?
Yeah, because those systems, those are usually established under the collective bargaining agreement. So when those agreements go poof, those mechanisms for resolving workplace disputes go with them.
So what happens to employees who are already in the middle of a dispute? Is there anything in the act about that?
Yes, actually Section 4B addresses that directly, and it says that all pending arbitration dispute, resolution, grievance proceedings, anything based on these now terminated agreements, all of them have to be dismissed immediately.
So even if you're already fighting for something?
Doesn't matter. When the act takes effect, those cases are done.
Wow, that's a lot to process. So employees would lose their right to bargain, they lose the protections they have now, and they'd lose any ongoing avenues for resolving disputes.
It's a major shift. And on top of all that, federal agencies could pretty much immediately implement changes to workplace policies, things that they used to have to negotiate or that were spelled out in the contracts, all that would be up in the air.
And of course, employees wouldn't be allowed to join or participate in unions for collective bargaining anymore.
Right, that's explicitly forbidden.
Okay, so we've talked about what happens to the employees. What about the federal agencies themselves? What's the immediate impact on them?
Well, the first thing is they're free from all the obligations and restrictions that were part of those collective bargaining agreements.
So no more contracts to worry about.
No more contracts, no legal requirement to recognize unions or negotiate with them. Anything that was in the works in terms of negotiations, that all stops.
Just ends.
Just like that.
Okay.
And just like on the employee side, any pending arbitration and grievance cases, those would be dismissed too. So some issues might actually get resolved more quickly from the agency's point of view, at least.
Interesting. And then going forward, they would have a lot more power to decide things like wages and benefits.
Oh, yeah. Their managerial discretion would increase significantly. They'd have a lot more freedom to set those terms and conditions of employment.
It sounds like they come out ahead.
Well, there are potential downsides, even in the short term.
Oh, really?
Yeah, our sources point out that there could be some initial confusion and disruption as agencies figure out how to operate without the structure of those agreements they're used to.
So even with more freedom, it might not be smooth sailing.
Right, they'll have to come up with new policies and procedures for all the things that used to be covered by collective bargaining.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've looked at the immediate aftermath. Now let's zoom out a bit and think about the long-term implications if this act stays in place. Let's start with the federal employees again. What are the potential long-term consequences for them?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is that without the power of collective bargaining, federal employees could see a gradual erosion of their wages, benefits, and overall working conditions.
So things could actually get worse for them over time.
It's definitely a possibility. The analysis suggests that without that structured negotiation process, there might not be as much pressure on agencies to keep those things competitive.
So they might start offering less and less.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of job security that could be significantly weakened without those contractual protections against layoffs, or the requirement for just cause termination. Those are often key parts of union agreements.
Right, those safeguards would be gone.
And if you look at historical trends in other sectors where union membership has declined, you often see wages stagnating and benefits getting cut back. It's
Yeah.
pattern.
So federal employees could be looking at less job security and lower pay in the long run.
That's a very real concern based on the research, and it doesn't stop there. The ways that federal employees can address grievances, those would probably become more limited too. They might have to rely on internal agency processes that might not feel as impartial.
So less recourse if they feel like they've been wronged.
Right, and with management having more discretion, it's possible that decisions about employment terms would become more unilateral, less input from the employees themselves.
And it would be harder for them to come together and push for changes.
It's exactly. Their ability to advocate for themselves collectively would be significantly diminished. And all of this could lead to lower morale and lower productivity, especially if employees feel like their rights and their working conditions are deteriorating.
So it's not just about the money, it's about the whole work environment.
Exactly. And in the long term, you'd likely see a pretty significant power imbalance tilting even more in favor of the federal agencies.
Okay, so let's flip it around then. What are the potential long-term impacts on the agencies themselves?
Well, the long-term outlook for them is a bit mixed. On the one hand, they would maintain that increased managerial flexibility and control over the workforce.
Which they probably like.
Yes, and there's also the possibility of significant long-term cost savings if they choose to reduce wages and benefits.
So they could potentially come out ahead financially.
That's one side of the coin.
Hmm.
But there are potential drawbacks too. For example, there could be an increase in individual employee lawsuits related to employment disputes if employees feel like they don't have any other way to address their concerns.
So more legal battles.
Possibly. And agencies might find it harder to attract and retain highly skilled workers, especially if federal compensation and benefits become less competitive compared to what the private sector is offering.
So they could save money, but then struggle to get good people.
Exactly. It's a trade-off. And then there's the issue of employee engagement and productivity. If employees are unhappy, if they feel undervalued and like they don't have a voice, that can impact how well the agency functions overall.
So morale could become a real problem.
It's a risk. And to address that, agencies would likely have to invest in developing really robust and fair alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. Something to replace what they're losing with the collective bargaining agreements,
They'd have to build a whole new system.
essentially. And then finally, there's this point that without the structure of collective bargaining, the terms and conditions of federal employment could become more vulnerable to political influences, shifting priorities of different administrations, that kind of thing.
So less stability and more uncertainty. Okay, let's get into some of the specifics of the Act itself now. Section 4A, that's the one about terminating the collective bargaining agreements. Is there anything we should highlight about that?
Well, the key takeaway there is that it's immediate and comprehensive all existing collective bargaining agreements, regardless of when they were established or what stage they're at. All of them are terminated as soon as this act becomes law.
No grace periods.
None. It's not a gradual phase out. The legal basis for those agreements just disappears overnight.
Wow. Okay. And then there's Section 4B. That's the one that says pending legal proceedings have to be dismissed. Why is that so important?
That section is crucial because it effectively shuts down any existing process for resolving workplace disputes that were created under the current system. It's not just about future disagreements. Any arbitration, any dispute resolution, any grievance process that's already underway, if it's based on one of those terminated agreements, it has to be stopped.
So it's like hitting a reset button.
In a way, both employees and agencies who are in the middle of resolving issues through those established processes would have to find a new way forward.
Okay, so now let's talk about Section 5. This one seems really significant. It calls for repealing Chapter 71 of Title 5 of the U.S. Code.
Right.
Can you explain why that's such a big deal?
So for anyone who might not be familiar with legal citations, Chapter 71 of Title 5, that's the foundation, the legal bedrock for how labor and management relations work in the federal government right now. It's the law that gives federal employees the right to organize and bargain collectively. So when Section 5 says repeal this chapter, what it's really saying is eliminate the entire legal basis for federal employee unions and collective bargaining.
So it's not just about ending the current contracts. It's about saying these things can't legally exist anymore.
Exactly. It's not just dissolving the current situation. It's removing the underlying legal permission for it to exist at all.
It's a whole different level.
Absolutely. And that repeal, it's directly tied to the termination of the agreements and the dismissal of the legal proceedings. It's all part of this comprehensive dismantling of the existing system. No more legal authorization, no more contracts, and no more ongoing processes related to federal collective bargaining.
Okay, earlier you mentioned some important definitions in Section 2. Can we go over those again, just so everyone's clear on who and what this act would affect?
Definitely. So federal employee, that's defined really broadly. It means anyone who works for a federal agency and then a federal agency. That's defined by referencing another part of the U.S. Code. But basically, it includes all the usual suspects, executive departments, independent establishments, government entities, all that.
Makes sense.
And then labor union, that's defined as any organization that represents federal employees on things like grievances, disputes, wages, hours, benefits, working conditions, all that. And finally, collective bargaining agreement. That's any agreement between a federal agency and a labor union, whether it's written down or just agreed upon orally, that sets the terms of employment for federal employees.
So they're really trying to cover all the bases here.
Yes. Very thorough. Very comprehensive.
Okay. And just to wrap up the background on this bill, remind us again of the key details.
Sure. So the official name is the Federal Workforce Freedom Act. It's Senate Bill number 1006, or S-1006. It was introduced in the Senate on March 12, 2025 by Senator Blackburn, with Mr. Lee as a co-sponsor, and once it was introduced, it was read twice and then referred to the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs for their review.
Okay, so to sum it all up, this Federal Workforce Freedom Act, it's a pretty radical proposal. It would prevent federal employees from forming unions or bargaining collectively. It would stop agencies from negotiating with unions. It would cancel all existing union contracts, shut down any related legal disputes that are in progress, and most importantly, it would get rid of the legal framework that allows for federal collective bargaining in the first place.
That's a great summary. It's a bold move with potential consequences that could ripple out across the entire federal workforce and really impact how the government functions.
Absolutely. The immediate impact would be huge, especially for employees. Lots of disruption and uncertainty.
For sure.
And long term, we could be looking at a very different federal workplace where management has a lot more power, and the implications for things like wages, benefits, job security, how disputes are resolved, all of that. It's really significant.
It's a pivotal moment.
It really is. Well, this has been an incredibly informative deep dive into a very complex and potentially transformative piece of legislation as we wrap up. Is there a key question that you think our listeners should really ponder as they consider all this?
I think the fundamental question here is, what are the essential ingredients for a productive and effective federal workforce? And how does the presence or absence of collective bargaining affect those ingredients? How does shifting the balance of power between management and employees impact the government's ability to function well in the long run?
That's a great point. Something to really think about for our listeners who want to explore this further. We highly recommend looking into Chapter 71 of Title 5 U.S. Code, and of course keep an eye on what happens with S-1006 as it moves through the legislative process. Hopefully this deep dive has given everyone a solid understanding of this bill and what it could mean for the future.
I hope so.
Thanks for joining us today.
A pleasure.